Hello and welcome. This is One Voice here on Asia One with me, Craig Vermay. In today's show, the latest findings from Amnesty International have once again thrust Sudan's devastating war into the international spotlight, accusing the Rapid Support Forces of committing crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing during their offensive in Al Fasher. Investigators allege civilians were deliberately targeted through mass killings, torture and summary executions, widespread rape and sexual slavery, and persecution of non-Arab ethnic communities. Children are reported to be among the victims, with entire civilian neighbourhoods allegedly coming under deliberate attack. The allegations come as Sudan's civil war enters its fourth year, showing little sign of ending, despite Sudanese armed forces regaining control of much of Khartoum early this year. Instead, the fighting has shifted west, and fierce battles centred on North Darfur and North Kordofan, as both sides fight for key towns and supply routes. Humanitarian agencies warn the military conflict is fueling even greater humanitarian catastrophe. More than 30 million people now need humanitarian assistance. Around 14 million have been displaced in the world's largest displacement crisis. And millions face acute hunger as hospitals collapse and aid deliveries remain blocked by insecurity and damaged infrastructure. The United Nations continues to describe Sudan as the world's largest humanitarian emergency, warning that without immediate ceasefire, protection for civilians and unhindered aid access, the suffering will only deepen. As the war drags on, fears are growing that continue for alleged atrocities with entrenched cycle of violence that could go on for years. To help unpack what is happening behind the headlines is Danielle Reeder, Doctor of International Law at the University of Manchester. Now, before we look into the latest reports that are coming out of the country, briefly, why did this war start 4 years ago?
Thank you so much. This current iteration of conflict in Sudan starts with a contest between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces. This current iteration is a disagreement about how to integrate the Rapid Support Forces into the Sudanese armed forces after conflict. But like many of these issues, the historical background goes much further. And this goes all the way back to historical conflicts, but also quite specifically conflict in the Darfur region starting in the early 2000s. During that time, there was a genocide committed against non-Arab peoples within that region, mostly instigated by the Janjaweed militia. After the Janjaweed militia was reconstituted, they overthrew the leader, Omar al-Bashir, and that's when the Rapid Support Forces were reconstituted into a new entity. But after this conflict continued on, there was disagreement between the heads of these two entities about how the country should go forward, and this broke into devastating civil strife.
So, as I said in the introduction, that the Sudanese armed forces have regained much of Khartoum and seems to have pushed the fighting into other areas. So how did this come about?
This has come about through the expansion of the conflict and having these two entities trying to take more ground. We've seen that in the north of Darfur and Al Fasher, there was great devastation that carried through in all the way through in 2025, and that we have now seen that this has also spread to the Al Obeid region as well. As this conflict continues on, there seems to be more fueling this conflict that doesn't have to do with the original source of whether or not this is about land or whether or not this is about who is controlling power, but it also seems to be that there are external forces that are contributing. There are reports by Amnesty International, there are reports by Humanitarian Rights Council of the United Nations about how the war economy is being fueled in this, and there are reports of commodities such as gold or other rare earth minerals and materials that are actually being brought into this conflict and exacerbating it outside of the original source of this conflict. So this is why this is spreading.
So are we seeing external players then coming into the conflict that are wanting to exploit the natural resources, or has it remained internal?
Yes, this is it's not particularly unique, but it's characterized for this iteration of the Sudanese conflict that external actors are incredibly involved in what's happening. In the United Nations, there have been debates about how this conflict has unfolded. There are different representatives in different committees, such as the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council or the Human Rights, that talk about how these external actors are actually exacerbating this conflict. In the most recent debate of the Human Rights Council that occurred just a few days ago, different country representatives also talked about how external actors are actually exacerbating this conflict. Oftentimes, these comments are made without naming names, but it is clear that there are support that is happening for both sides. So there are external actors that are supporting the Sudanese armed forces, and there are external actors that are also supporting the rapid support forces. Yes.
So has either side made any great territorial gain?
Well, the Sudanese armed forces, as you've already stated, have been successful in taking back Khartoum, and they have made some territorial gain because as the official or transitionary entity of Sudan, they are the representatives that come before the United Nations and for these councils, and they are the body that on international bodies for support. The sanctions that were carried out by the U.S. last year against key individuals who are against key individuals of the RSF, Security Council resolutions that have been tabled within the committee have called specifically on the RSF to cease its activity. And so it's been recognized that the RSF is the errant paramilitary identity within this conflict. So territorially, there have been some gains, and the Sudanese armed forces at least have the benefit of sort of international recognition in this conflict as being the legitimate foreseers of what will happen in the future.
Now, a couple of times you've mentioned the UN. So
yes.
When it's spoken about in the UN, is anything meaningful coming out of it?
In different committees, it is important that countries are discussing what is happening in this region. One of the main purposes of the United Nations is to enact provisions of collective security, and not just for protecting the territorial integrity of states, but also for protecting the human rights of individuals within those states. So a body like the Human Rights Council, who is able to carry out investigations, and they have reports that do fact-finding and gather evidence. This is important because at the very least there needs to be a record of what is happening, and so that these events aren't just sort of relegated to history. But at the same time, these resolutions use this language that we're now very familiar with, how we note the devastation, how it is grave, how we call on all bodies to adhere to their obligations under international law. But it's very difficult for these kind of resolutions to really have teeth or enforcement. One of the reasons is because sometimes when these statements are being brought in international committees by certain countries, those countries may also be acting in their own interests in other forums. So, for example, again, in this recent debate, representative of Kenya on behalf of the African group stated that they were very against what was happening and the civilians, but they were also championing the territorial integrity of Sudan, forwarding African solutions to African problems. And on this group, United Arab Emirates is quite prominent in being within that mediation forum, as well as being within that mediation forum of the Quad, which is made up of the U.S., Egypt as well. But Sudan has specifically called out United Arab Emirates for supporting paramilitary forces, but also being complicit in genocide. And this is something that they made an application to the International Court of Justice for last year. So there's a little bit of a structural contradiction for some of the parties involved that on the one hand say they want to end the conflict, but on the other hand also seem to be exacerbating the conflict through trade or behind the scenes means.
Do you think there's a place for either an African or a UN sort of peacekeeping or observer force to have more teeth to report what's going on? Because sadly, in the introduction to you, I said that it's put Sudan's war back into the headlines. And we're talking sort of tens of millions of people affected. It's not a small isolated incident. So when an Amnesty International report comes out, it thrusts it back to the top of the headlines, but really it should be there all the time. Do you think there should be more information coming out? Should there be a peacekeeping force put in place? I understand that the UN has lost a bit of its teeth that it used to have, that no longer wants to be more involved in the edges of conflicts as much. But do you think there's more can be done?
This was a very appropriate and difficult question. The United Nations does have to be entirely committed to facing atrocities as they appear, and something that the United Nations has always struggled with to some extent is having enough consensus and political will within the UN General Assembly and within the UN Security Council to actually create any kind of enforcement. In terms of regional mechanisms, it's incredibly important that regional mechanisms are able to work, but at the same time, that still requires that same political buy-in and that same commitment to ensuring that peace and security is paramount in that respect. So once again, in terms of the African Union, yes, there is a lot of potential here. And we also see that in terms of where we are internationally and globally, there is more of a shift from some of these international forums like the United Nations to more regional forums like the African Union and their collective security mechanisms. But at the same time, there has to be a really serious focus on this war economy and this supply chain. There's not much good in sitting before these debates and these committees talking about how much you care about the humanitarian situation if your country at the same time is supplying drones or very particular weapons that you do know are going to be used within the context of overwhelmingly targeting civilians. So there's a lot more for regional and international bodies to do, but that focus really has to be on disrupting the supply chain.
How would the African Union be able to break that supply chain? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So,
yes. Yes. Breaking that supply, not ignoring the evidence. I mean, so one of the things that was coming out in this particular onslaught of attacks against civilians was the use of drones. And drones are not sort of a traditional stock, conventional weapon that you might have or may have been handed down somehow through sort of backlog trade. These are new technologies that are intentionally created, and how and where those are coming from are very clear. It's very traceable how a new AI system, for example, that is being embedded into a drone technology well, who made it. There's a traceability there. So breaking that supply chain really comes through will for sanctioning, a will for ending this, and having the, I would say, timidity to sort of address that this is what will stop and prevent this crisis going forward.
Today, I'm looking at the war in Sudan. The battlefield may have shifted, but Sudan's humanitarian catastrophe continues to grow. New allegations of ethnic cleansing and widespread abuses come as international community struggles to stop one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. To help me understand what is happening, with me is Danielle Reeder, Doctor of International Law at the University of Manchester. Now, let's turn our attention to the humanitarian crisis. Now, Amnesty International is alleging that as the forces are fighting outside Khartoum, they're now saying that there are crimes against humanity, villages are being attacked. How can, when there are two forces that nobody seems to be able to control at the moment, how can the international community stop or intervene or slow what's happening at the moment?
Thank you so much. So one of the ways in which the international community can react to this is by understanding, knowing, and caring. If we think back to the early 2000s, and specifically in 2004, there was a lot of media attention happening in Darfur. For those of us who can remember, around that time, there were campaigns, people were in the street, there was a slogan, "Save Darfur," and that was actually quite instrumental in encouraging states to care. As we see from a lot of our government representatives, especially along the transatlantic corridor, someone like the Trump White House, the Trump administration, don't really turn their attention to these issues until they feel like it's going to start affecting, their voter base or their popularity or something. So it's very important, especially in these democratic communities, for people themselves to understand. And also to, actually ask our states to, when they represent us in these international forums, to take responsibility and to actually do their job, which is to protect people around the world.
I don't know whether you've actually seen the Amnesty report, but when they're trying to gather evidence zones, do you know anything about the process?
I don't know particularly about the Amnesty International process or the method in which they gather evidence, but I do know that they have people on the ground, reporters and dedicated workers who are there doing the work for humanitarian accountability and fact-checking. It's very dangerous work, very important work, but it involves real people there doing that day in, day out.
So when you're talking about people controlling various forces, how can they be held accountable under international law?
So if we're talking about the actors, if we're talking about the leaders of, the Sudanese armed forces the rapid support forces, one of these things is about turning the attention to their obligations under international humanitarian law as well as international human rights law. Conflicts like this concern overwhelmingly the idea that a government in power has legitimate rights. And this is the conflict between the RSF and the SAF. Who is in charge, who is going on behalf of all of Sudan. That's the basic problem. But in order for you to actually be in charge of a peoples, you have an obligation to those peoples, and to care and have a duty of care to the integrity of their livelihoods. And so in the past, there have been investigations launched by the International Criminal Court against leaders. They are still active. There's still an active arrest warrant against the former president, Omar al-Bashir, and key members of his administration. But the international community could attempt to also launch such investigations, to use what mechanisms are in place at the ICC, to use what mechanisms are in place for the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. Materially, the most effective and immediate thing, sanctions and embargoes. And there hasn't been an embargo in the Sudanese area beyond the embargo against the Darfur region in 2004. But now it's time and possible to actually apply that embargo to all of Sudan.
So we often see in the news, in the bigger picture, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, but we rarely see anybody held accountable in the International Criminal Court. Does the system have to change?
Yes. So this has been a major critique of the international criminal system and how international criminal liability is established. The Rome Statute, which came into force in 2001, and established the International Criminal Court, is still quite new in terms of the longer span of international law. But some of the main critiques is that if we have these crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, aggression as established crimes, how are these actually investigated and prosecuted, and how are people brought to justice? There has been a lot of critique about whether or not this applies only to the global South. Why isn't the same intensity scrutinized against actions of actors in the global North? But even besides that, I mean, there are the atrocities that do come, and a lot of these are there are successful investigations and successful prosecutions that, for whatever reason, aren't very highlighted in the media. But even with that in mind, the system doesn't seem to have a very quick or effective way of bringing these leaders to account, or anyone who's in charge of instigating these mass atrocities. So the system definitely does have to change. Now, whether that is other international bodies, it's unclear. But I think greater dialogue between groups like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or people who are very concerned about shining a light on what is happening, will be very key into helping shift and creating more accountability.
Mm-hmm. So if it does come out that the accusations, because there are only accusations at the moment by Amnesty International of crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing, etc., if they are proven, what do you think the likelihood is of somebody being held accountable?
If they are proven, there will be someone held accountable in order to, I suppose, tie up this conflict. In terms of ending how internationally, great powers would probably be very interested in not leaving it just up to anything goes. So there probably will be some kind of investigation that will happen at the conclusion of this. But at the time, it seems like international actors are sort of hedging their bets on who is going to be more successful, or what kind of benefit can be extracted from this kind of conflict at the moment. And this has to do with a greater claim that is, I would have to make outside of this program, about the use of proxies and how proxy warfare actually occurs within connection to powers and great power states. So it is likely that, for lack of a better term, a head might roll when this conflict is over, but it doesn't really signal that our international systems of accountability are functioning or are effective, and we'll still have to come back and look at this conflict as well as other conflicts now and really question how we have handled this as an international society.
Mm-hmm. You said that for anyone running a country, it's their responsibility to look after the people. Now, at the moment, the aid is not getting in. There are people dying of hunger. And when I say people, there are millions of people in this situation. Is there a legal framework that can be used to get more help into the population that needs it?
Well, the legal frameworks that exist, there is international humanitarian law, and those are all of the customary provisions that exist for laws that apply in armed conflict, distinguishing between combatants and civilians at all times. But these laws, these customary laws, which are already being violated at a massive scale, doesn't particularly help in terms of that particular question of getting aid in. Like in other conflicts, this question of how do we get aid in, one of the mechanisms that can be used is the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. So if the UN General Assembly voices an opinion whether aid should be allowed in or how can it be allowed in, or if the UN Security Council has a resolution that actually passes and says that countries have to do something in order to allow aid in, that would be somewhat instrumental in allowing that to happen. As we've also seen in other conflicts, like in Gaza, there could be some provisions for setting up temporary organizations or using these international humanitarian organizations that could be allowed in at a time. But as we have also seen in conflicts like Gaza, those aid organizations have to be allowed to operate. If the host country doesn't actually let them do the work that they are established to do, that aid still doesn't get in. So we have mechanisms in place, we have legal frameworks in place, but the problem is, even with those legal frameworks, that doesn't guard against violations of those frameworks.
Because the UN has said it's one of the worst humanitarian disasters ever seen on the planet. And so obviously something has to be done. Aid needs to get to these people. And you need to open aid routes for people to be able to get aid in. And when you're dealing with two very different entities, safety becomes a major issue for international teams to move around, doesn't it?
Yes, but the international powers that could be instrumental here, the Gulf states could be instrumental here. Russia could be instrumental here. Even the U.S. could be instrumental here. There is possibility and provisions for them to, for example, establish a humanitarian corridor starting from Port Sudan into these regions. That's something that could be done. And so this is a suggestion or recommendation that could be floored within these international bodies, and using this this protection and this armament and this military kit that actually exists in order to aid in humanitarian protection.
Why hasn't that happened yet, if we've got so many people in such a dire situation?
As I view it, it's just a lack of political will, lack of interest at the moment. These causes for humanitarian protection or responsibility to protect, these are ideas that were quite popular perhaps a few decades ago, but haven't been very popular in recent times. They're not particularly flashy, and for governments now that are overwhelmingly concerned with sort of the media appearance or how they seem, and maybe less concerned with the actual work of global responsibility, this just hasn't been very high on their agenda.
So the international community calls for a ceasefire in Sudan. There seems to be lots of words and little pressure from where I'm seeing. Is there more work going on behind than we know about?
There is work in terms of negotiations and international mediation forums within that region that are happening behind the scenes. But it's difficult because the forum for these mediations rely on getting RSF and SAF to sit down and come to terms for that ceasefire. And whatever is agreed, parties might walk away unsatisfied because it doesn't necessarily give either party entirely what they want. And because this conflict is really, really more about victory and that military victory for these groups, the humanitarian situation still seems quite incidental and not of a massive concern. And this also sort of feeds into a greater and more troubling moment that we're seeing now in terms of conflict in various regions of the world, that civilian lives are just seen as totally incidental to these greater military aims.
Mm-hmm. If there was one thing that you could change today and to make the situation or start the steps towards a ceasefire, what would you do today?
One thing that I think would be incredibly important would be to have more visibility from the African Union in terms of speaking to the international community about the mediation steps and about the regional measures that are being taken. And within this, there needs to be unity and consensus about how this conflict ends. The difficulty is that if different countries are supportive of one side or the other, this becomes complicated. So what I would like to see is taking a step back from that support of, the one general versus the other, and really emphasizing the need to protect these civilians and especially women and children in this conflict. So, of course, it would be ideal if the United Nations could fulfill, and the UN Security Council could fulfill a more active collective security role. But in terms of today, what I think needs to happen is for the African Union to really start clarifying how it's going to be involved in sort of de-escalating this conflict.
Danielle, thank you very much for your time today. And that brings us to the end of today's conversation, where I looked at the Sudanese war and the tragedy that is unfolding, and it's simply no longer a story about competing armies or shifting front lines. It is a test of whether the international community can move beyond statements of concern and prevent further atrocities while millions of civilians remain trapped in impossible conditions. The allegations documented by Amnesty International will add to growing calls for independent investigations and accountability. But for the families facing hunger and displacement and the constant violence, justice remains just as distant as ever. The challenge now is whether diplomacy, humanitarian assistance, and sustained international pressure can finally change the trajectory of a war that has already devastated an entire nation. Thank you very much to Danielle Reeder, Doctor of International Law at the University of Manchester, for sharing your insights. And as always, here on One Voice, we aim to cut through the noise and bring you the stories that matter from the voices that know. And if you missed any part of today's show, be sure to go to our YouTube channel, Asia One News. Until next time, I'm Craig Vermay. Thank you for watching One Voice.